Warning, this video will be a departure from my usual style. Unlike my other videos, this is an FAQ video where I'll be trying to answer viewers' questions. And as they say, be careful what you ask for because you might just get it. You have been warned, and this is a public service announcement. Anyhow, I'd like to begin by responding to Vincent and Barak who were the ones who suggested I do this video in the first place. Vincent asks 4 questions. First, what best piece of advice would you give to your students? Well, Vincent, I think that the answer would be, look for where your talents and desires intersect with the world's needs and then live toward that. That's because if you just focus on your own desires and talents and don't take into account the world's needs, your contribution to things probably won't be very deep and your life will become a pragmatic nightmare. On the other hand, if you just defer to the world's needs, most obviously in the form of doing whatever the world will pay the most for, you probably won't be fulfilled as a human being. Yeah, you can make money that way, but it won't really matter if you wind up an empty husk of a person, probably neck deep in a midlife crisis in 25 years or so. The trick is to find a way of doing both at the same time, to pay your bills and still have a soul. Vincent then asks, if you were not a teacher, what would you do? Well, earlier in my life, I was a computer scientist who wrote software professionally, but I probably wouldn't go back to that. I'd want a new adventure instead. I sometimes joke to my classes that I'd make a great greeter at Walmart, but I'd probably be fired pretty quickly for saying things like, "Welcome to the grand cavalcade of materialism, folks. We hope you enjoy your stay." But actually, I don't really know what my real answer would be to that question, Vincent. I might have to think about that some more, especially since my retirement is starting to loom in the distance. Vincent then asks, what is for you the best value? I think that for me, the best value, the thing most worth living toward, is compassionate enlightenment, mostly the way the Mahayana Buddhists describe it. And finally, he asks, what is your favorite movie and why? I think my 3 most favorite movies are Amadeus, Interview with the Vampire, and The Omega Man. Monty Python and the Holy Grail gets props for the single funniest movie of all time, at least according to me. However, my single favorite of those probably varies from day to day. I'm pretty much a sucker for good writing, and all other factors are considerably less important to me. It has to be poetically luminous and incisive too. Today, maybe I'd pick Amadeus for the writing, but also for the tension it illustrates between brilliance and the resentment of brilliance, which to me says a lot about life generally. Okay, next, Barak asks 2 somewhat involved questions which I'll try to distill. First, he asks, are we human beings prone to self-destructive behavior, and if so, what can we do about it? Yes, I think that self-destruction, the Thanatos drive as Freud put it, is part of our human lot. You can see it in history, a large fraction of which depicts in no uncertain terms how we human beings have gone out of our way again and again and again to generate living hell on earth. But you can also see it at the individual level, especially since most of us end up being our own worst enemies, and then lying to ourselves about it on top of that. So personally, I've come to a profound appreciation for how deeply darkness runs through our human constitution. So, what can be done about it? Well, for me, the worst thing is to pretend like it isn't there. Or like we can just flip a switch that will magically erase its existence, both of which are very common responses. But those are just ways of engaging in what's sometimes known as spiritual bypassing, the illusory attempt to leap past all the hard work that's necessary for genuine growth. The real way past our darkness is to live through it, with a full cognizance and acceptance of it, moment by moment, until eventually it loses its hold over us. But of course, that means that we need to cultivate patience with ourselves and with our world. And right now, the human race is very impatient, which is one of our primary obstacles to bettering our world. Basically, our impatience for a better world is exactly what's getting in the way of a better world. Second, Barak asks, if life has no inherent or necessary meaning, then how can we still move forward with our lives? Well, Barak, what keeps me going in spite of all of the capriciousness, absurdity, and craziness of life is the adventure of creating meaning where there wasn't any before. So my answer is basically creative. The challenge of life isn't so much to reveal its necessary meaning, but to invent and reinvent a compelling meaning for our lives as we go. And I find that there's a kind of playful delight in doing that. So the reason to get out of bed in the morning isn't to find or fulfill some hidden meaning that's waiting for us like buried treasure. It's to become the artists and inventors of our own lives, and in the process to create a meaningful path for our brief existence in this world. Basically, the reason to strive is that there's no reason to strive. But to realize that, we need to step beyond the whole paradigm of only doing things for good practical reasons. We need to move past a merely practical mindset and enter into a more artistic relation to life. When we do that, life doesn't need to have a reason or a meaning because it's our job to create one for it. And when you think about it, what better reason to get out of bed could there possibly be? Next, Tim Deptula and Noobcakes Z ask about my view of political correctness and the social justice movement in academia. Well, my view is that political correctness and social justice were initially interesting and fruitful lines of inquiry in the academic world, but have now become excessive and unhealthy fixations, especially in the social sciences and humanities, which includes disciplines like those of psychology, philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. It seems to me that these kinds of academic disciplines have become overly preoccupied with policing people's linguistic expressions, their thoughts, and moral values, especially in a way that brings them into alignment with a leftist political ideology. To me, too much of this kind of activity is unhealthy because it undermines the deeper, better destinies of these disciplines, which is always to perceive and understand reality as well as we can, not to be co-opted into becoming crypto-political operatives. Basically, we're never going to understand ourselves if our first priority is always to manipulate the levers of power in a certain way. But it seems to me like that's what's often happening these days, that in the academic world, the quasi-political agenda is eclipsing the whole project of seeking the truth of things. However, at this point, I should probably say that my complaint isn't about academ's leftist proclivities per se. If 90% of academicians in the social sciences were espousing a conservative version of political correctness and social justice, my complaint would be exactly the same. That's because my concern is that the political agenda is outstripping the academic agenda, and the whole recent preoccupation with political correctness and social justice is just a symptom of that deeper malaise. It's like we're forgetting what our job actually is. Of course, when pressed, I find that most academicians claim to adhere to a leftist ideology simply because it's the one that's inherently superior to any other alternative. However, it seems obvious to me that there is no such thing as an inherently superior political ideology. To me, it's a straightforward and perennial truth that sometimes the right has the better argument and sometimes the left does. That's because life is just too complex and subtle and varied to be captured by any singular political point of view. So I do not hold with the academic majority, who would say that leftist politics, and hence all of the ideological apparatus of political correctness and social justice, is, ipso facto, the best or only worthwhile position. Life is just not that simple. And as I said in my video on shame and privilege, it's always a question of exactly whose vision of justice and political correctness is the one that's supposed to be imposed on everyone else. So, to answer an additional related question from T-Bone, I don't have a single stable political affiliation. I take things on a case-by-case basis, and I find that overall, the right and the left are about equally maladroit and inept. And anyhow, I don't think that deep change in our world actually issues from the political sphere in the first place. My own experience is that having politician A in office as opposed to politician B hardly ever changes us in any deep way, at the level where we live and breathe, for instance. Sure, it can make our world more or less agreeable or more or less difficult, but that's different from what really changes us. That's what I'm interested in. Okay, next, Awareness and Neil Deshmukh ask how I see free will, and by implication, determinism. To me, Jean Paul Sartre has the best answer to this. Basically, he affirms free will, but also elements of contingency or facticity at the same time. Basically, we're always free to decide the meaning, or at least our attitude, toward the parts of our lives that we don't have any choice over. For instance, I can't by fiat decide to inhabit Michael Jordan's body rather than my own, but I can decide how I will take up the facticity of being in my body, whether I feel good about it or not, or what I'll do with my body today, etc. In other words, by deciding on our attitude or posture, we're also deciding on how we're experiencing reality. The reason why the riddle of free will versus determinism has been so vexing for so many centuries is that neither of the binary absolutes adequately captures reality as we know it. So, it's futile to argue either for an absolutized vision of free will or for an absolutized vision of determinism. The trick is to find a way of conceiving of them that captures and integrates both simultaneously, which is, of course, one of the paradoxical aspects of our lives, that we're both free and unfree simultaneously. Next, Pedro 216961 and Brad Barkley ask about my view of self-teaching, especially in light of the alienation many people feel about institutionalized education as it currently exists. My own feeling is that self-teaching isn't inherently better or worse than any other type. It's all a matter of what best fits a particular person at a particular point in his or her life. For some people, individual learning is best. For others, learning alongside other people is best. Wisdom is about knowing what the moment is really calling for and then responding in kind. So the real question, Pedro and Brad, is self-learning really what's best for you at this point in time? The trick is to see as deeply into your heart as possible, and then to let go of any answer that feels hollow or rote or habitual, and then to act directly on whatever life is telling you. Next, Rick Chambers asks some questions about my video on wisdom and education. He asks if I can name an example of someone whom I regard as wise. Yes, Rick, I can, but I'm reluctant to name someone famous, mostly because it seems to me that people's public images aren't necessarily an accurate reflection of their actual wisdom. Sure, the public image of people like the Dalai Lama or Gandhi or Mother Teresa makes it seem like they must be wise people. But who knows how they really are in their lives? So, to me, it's better to localize wisdom in the everyday run of life. Of course, there are many modes of wisdom in this world, which is part of what makes it such a tricky thing to understand. But let me tell you about Clint, the guy who built the storage shed in my backyard about 15 years ago. Turns out that Clint was a superb craftsman, and while he worked alone in my backyard, every movement of his body radiated an almost preternatural efficiency and an abiding concern for the quality of what he was doing. Watching him work was almost like witnessing a miracle, like glimpsing something impossible, like he was performing a staggering, almost incomprehensible feat of magic in my backyard. Anyhow, it seems to me that wise people care very deeply about the quality of what they do and what they give birth to in this world. Not because they're trying to impress other people, but for its own sake. They're able to use their talents to their fullest and to take real joy in doing so. Their lives are about dwelling in the eternal moment, in the incalculable fullness of their craft, and their joy is to ride that arc of involvement as faithfully and as beautifully as they can. Okay, next, 29 Rooks asks, what do you think makes teachers turn bad? Well, one answer would be that they haven't developed wisdom like Clint the shed builder evidently had. In other words, As I said in one of my videos about teaching, a lot of teachers don't really know why they're teaching, and so they can only offer students flimsy and unconvincing rationales for learning. Second, a lot of teachers aren't really passionate about the work, probably mostly because they don't really have a compelling reason for doing it in the first place. They're not seeking, and hence they're not often finding, deep joy or ecstasy in their craft. Instead, they're content with being merely mediocre teachers, and so they are. A kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And finally, for a lot of teachers, the world is changing, and with it, so too is their students' way of perceiving and experiencing things. But they themselves often remain stolid and unchanging. But not only that, as teachers get older, these kinds of issues, which were probably always there, can easily become more salient in their experience. So imagine getting older, seeing your best days behind you, and at the same time recognizing that you don't really have a deep, passionate relation to teaching and never really did. And at the same time, imagine seeing students' consciousness becoming ever more distant from your own. Well, 29, you're probably getting the picture. Next, T-Bone asks who my top favorite philosophers are. Well, if you include Buddhist thinkers as philosophers, it would probably be Shunryu Suzuki, Martin Heidegger, Chogyam Trungpa, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Albert Camus. If you're just counting Western philosophers, then add Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Buber. As far as texts by those thinkers, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Being and Time, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, The Gay Science, The Myth of Sisyphus, Being and Time, and I and Thou. T-Bone also asks which YouTube channels I watch. Here are some I like to watch: Philip McKnight, A Dose of Buckley, Vegan Gains, Sargon of Akkad, Jordan Peterson, and the Yankee Marshal. And finally, how I got interested in philosophy is that I was first interested in artificial intelligence during my computer science days. That led me to psychology, which in turn led me to phenomenological psychology, which then got me interested in philosophy. But a more general answer would be, by remaining curious about life and interested in it, I eventually ended up wandering into the terrain of philosophy. In my view, a lot of life boils down to just staying interested. Next, Polypolius asks about the relationship between phenomenology and cognitive science, especially with regard to Dreyfus's lectures on Heidegger's Being and Time. Well, although I haven't read Dreyfus's work since grad school, my understanding is that he pretty much follows Heidegger's critique of metaphysics found in the introductions to Being and Time, where pretty much all metaphysical and scientific inquiry since the time of the pre-Socratics has been ungrounded in any systematic phenomenological inquiry into the question of being. Naturally, that would include the entire apparatus of today's cognitive science. It's not so much that they're at odds with each other, it's more that one can't really convincingly ask about the structure of cognition without connecting it in some meaningful way to an understanding of the nature of being. That's because human beings, the kind of beings that cognize, are, first and foremost, a type of being. Yes, like so many parts of the scientific world, cognitive science can still yield useful insights. But without conjoining its insights with a significant understanding of the nature of being, those insights will never fulfill their best potential for our lives or our world. There'll always be a lingering estrangement between what we know and what we are. Next, Ethan Boss asks about the relationship between suffering and creative synthesis. My own view of this comes mostly out of a Buddhist understanding of the nature of suffering. According to that treatment, human existence is unavoidably full of a lot of suffering, which is rooted in our attachments and aversions. In other words, suffering is something like an ontological category from this perspective, that is, an inescapable part of our human lot. If that's true, then any creative product that emerges from our lives will be inescapably shaped and conditioned by how we've suffered in life, in both obvious and subtle ways. But the same would be true of our joys. Creative synthesis is an expression of both our agony and our ecstasy, hence the title of Irving Stone's novel about Michelangelo. Okay, next, Trey S. asks if I've read Freud and what I think about his work. Yes, I've read Freud, but only about 10% of the standard edition, which is about 5 feet in length overall. I have a deep appreciation for the way Freud opened up the unconscious, and especially the way he conjoined Eros and Thanatos in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Of course, later psychodynamic thinkers have pointed to numerous weaknesses in many of Freud's observations about the nature of the unconscious, but props to Freud for opening up that terrain in the first place. Was he indebted to antecedents like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in this? Yes, I think he was. But still, his was a monumental achievement for the time, at least in my view. Next, Mithrindilcraft asks me what I think about anti-rational rhetoric in today's mainstream politics. Well, in my view, the political terrain is mostly a reflection of the larger social terrain. As de Tocqueville once famously put it, we get the leaders we deserve. So the anti-rationalism in the political sphere is really only a reflection of the larger anti-rationalism that's currently running through American culture. As far as the optimal place of rationality in our lives, both politically and otherwise, I feel that it's important to honor the great gifts of rationality. On the other hand, there's more to life than just being rational about everything. Our passions can also be great sources of wisdom for us, among other things. So the question is whether today's anti-rationalism is mostly a way of inviting what might transcend mere rationality while simultaneously embracing its gifts, or whether it's just a way of negating and ignoring those gifts and retreating to a less mature, less evolved form of rhetorical practice. My perception is that it's mostly the latter these days. However, I hope to be proven wrong about that. In a similar vein, Gerhard Thiel asks about the place of romanticization, especially in comparison to the charm of being rational. Well, Gerhard, as you might infer from my answer to Mithrindilcraft, I feel that both reason and romance have their places in the larger totality of things. The trick is not to treat them as elements of some kind of binary opposition, but to seek to incorporate the gifts of both into our lives. Once again, wisdom is about learning to respond to what life is actually asking of us. And sometimes it's asking for a more rational response and sometimes a more romanticized response. So it behooves us to become conversant in both, as well as in their intermixture. Next, John Fraser asked 2 questions. First, he asked whether I think sentience necessarily involves the ability to give meaning. Although people use the word sentience to refer to the range that extends from simple sensation to the more complex activity of integrating those sensations into coherent perceptions, I think that the most interesting variation on this question is any form of sensation also a form of meaning-making? In my view, it is. Differentiating red from green, for instance, is, in a primitive sense, a way of finding a kind of coherence in our experience. Basically, a primitive form of meaning, even if it seems very distant from meaning in the usual sense of a grand narrative that makes sense of life. The same would apply to the more or less coherent ways our bodies move along in the world, even though we're not usually aware that we're moving in any kind of meaningful relation to the physical world around us. Then, John asks, are our moral values ultimately about enhancing our prospects for survival? For me, a lot of this question depends upon how one defines morality. For some people, the moral good aligns itself mostly with lessening the prospects for survival. For instance, a lot of addictive morality works this way. In that case, the good in life is about getting our fix, despite the fact that it obviously entails accelerating the destruction both of ourselves and the people around us. However, morality in its more customary sense, where the good is about enhancing people's lives, seems to fit into the survival paradigm much more easily. For instance, acts of altruism often enhance the survival of some larger group, even at the expense of one's own life. So, my overall answer would be, some forms of morality seem to be governed by an underlying will to survival. However, others do not. Next, Naufil Manasiya asks about how to deal with being surrounded by religious people who are always trying to foist their beliefs on him or her, especially since he or she can't leave the situation for practical reasons. For me, the best formula for dealing with situations like this, which crop up in most people's lives from time to time, is to recognize that those people have the right to express their beliefs and you have the right not to care. Probably they don't feel comfortable within themselves unless they can get you to agree with them. But that doesn't mean that you have to respond one way or another. You have the right not to be bothered by it, to let their voices sound in your ears like any other neutral sound, like birds chirping in the springtime. I bet that if you were to really live toward that, a lot of the irritation you're experiencing will go away. By the way, this works for a lot of rancorous argumentative interchanges on the internet too, which, by the way, little truth bomb here, practically no one really gives a crap about. And finally, Ocean asks, does expanding your awareness make life easier or harder or both? I think it makes life both easier and harder. On the easier side of the ledger, when we expand our awareness, we're more able to perceive things accurately, both in the external world and within ourselves too. This makes it easier to navigate more directly toward the kinds of lives we really want to be leading, with a fuller recognition of the world's realities too. However, by the same token, expanding our awareness also means that we're likely to be informed and guided by things that most other people can't perceive, which tends to generate difficulty along the social dimension. In addition, an expanding awareness means that we're changing, and other people often have difficulty with people who are in the process of change, especially when that change reaches all the way down to the core of our being. When we're caught in the gale of that kind of change, we're not likely to see things or value things the same way we did last week, or to have an easy agreement with our friends and loved ones. And that lack of constancy tends to make a lot of people nervous and invites their negative judgment and rejection of us. But the trick is, I think, to build our social worlds mostly around people who are also expanding their awareness, and who are consequently more sanguine about metamorphosis and its attendant lack of constancy. Anyhow, wow, that's a lot of questions, and probably a lot of irresponsible opinionating on my part too. So let me end by saying that my personal opinions about things certainly aren't to be taken as gospel. It's all just how things seem to me these days. As Dennis Miller used to say, that's all just my opinion. I could be wrong. But my hope is that by sharing my opinions about things, you can more easily discover your own. In any case, a great big thank you to one and all who asked me these questions. You guys rock. Hopefully my answers have been clear and informative, or at least disconcerting in an interesting way. In any case, thanks to one and all for participating, and have a great day.